She had never fired a gun in her life, but when the man who claimed to own her said she didn't have the nerve, and the new Apache chief gave her the smallest nod, everything changed. What followed wasn't just a warning shot. It was the first step toward a freedom she never believed possible. Thank you so much for watching and for all your comments. Let me know at the end if you liked the story, and where you're watching from, and why you're following this. The Arizona Territory stretched endlessly under the merciless July sun of 1878, where dust devils danced across the parched earth, and the heat shimmered like water over the cracked ground. In a weathered ranch house 15 miles from the nearest settlement, 22-year-old Margaret Hayes stood at the window, her delicate fingers gripping the rough wooden frame as she watched her husband Cornelius ride off with 3 hired hands toward the eastern pasture. Her honey-blonde hair, usually pinned neatly in a bun, had come loose in soft waves around her pale face, and her green eyes held a weariness that went far deeper than the day's heat. Cornelius Hayes was 62 years old, a wealthy cattle rancher who had purchased Margaret from her desperate father's debt 3 years ago, though they called it marriage to maintain respectability. The transaction had been simple, her father's gambling debts forgiven in exchange for his young daughter's hand. Cornelius was cruel in ways both obvious and subtle, his weathered face often twisted in contempt when he looked at her, his gnarled hands quick to grab her arm with bruising force when she displeased him. He kept her isolated on this ranch, forbidding her from riding into town without his permission, controlling every aspect of her existence like she was just another piece of property he owned. Margaret turned from the window and moved through the quiet house, her simple cotton dress rustling softly. She had learned to move silently over these 3 years, to make herself small and unnoticeable, to avoid triggering her husband's volatile temper. The house was well appointed with furniture brought from back east, but it felt like a prison decorated with fine things. She paused in the kitchen, her hands automatically beginning to prepare the evening meal even though it was only mid-afternoon. Routine kept her anchored, gave her something to focus on besides the empty years stretching ahead. Outside, the sound of approaching horses made her freeze. It wasn't the familiar rhythm of Cornelius's return, but something different, multiple riders moving with purpose. Margaret's heart quickened as she moved back to the window, peering through the curtain. What she saw made her breath catch in her throat. A group of Apache warriors sat mounted on their horses in a semicircle before the house, perhaps 20 of them, their presence commanding and absolute. They wore a mixture of traditional clothing and pieces taken from the white man's world, their long, dark hair flowing loose or bound with strips of cloth. Their faces were painted for war, and rifles rested across their laps with casual confidence. But it was the man at the center who drew Margaret's attention completely. He was young, perhaps in his late 20s, and he sat his horse with the bearing of someone born to lead. His powerful shoulders were bare except for a leather vest, revealing arms corded with muscle. His face was striking with high cheekbones, a strong jaw, and intense dark eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. A red cloth was bound around his forehead, keeping his shoulder-length black hair from his face. Even from a distance, Margaret could sense the strength radiating from him, not just physical, but something deeper, a presence that demanded respect. The warrior's eyes found her at the window, and for a moment, their gazes locked. Margaret knew she should be terrified, should be hiding in the cellar or running for the rifle Cornelius kept above the fireplace, but she found herself unable to look away. There was something in his expression that wasn't the cruelty she'd learned to expect from men. It was assessment, certainly, but also a kind of recognition, as if he saw something in her that others missed. One of the older warriors spoke in Apache, gesturing toward the house, and the young leader responded without breaking eye contact with Margaret. His voice was deep and measured, carrying authority that needed no volume to be heard. Finally, he looked away, speaking to his men, and 3 of them dismounted. Margaret's paralysis broke. She ran to the fireplace and grabbed the rifle, her hands shaking as she checked that it was loaded. She had never fired a gun in her life. Cornelius had forbidden it, saying weapons weren't for women. Her fingers fumbled with the heavy weapon as she heard boots on the porch. The door, which she had foolishly forgotten to bar, swung open. The young Apache leader stood in the doorway, having to duck slightly to enter. Up close, he was even more imposing. easily over 6 feet tall, his presence filling the room. 2 warriors flanked him, but his raised hand kept them at the threshold. "You are alone?" he asked in English, his accent thick but his words clear. His dark eyes swept the room, taking in every detail with the practiced efficiency of a warrior who had survived by noticing everything. Margaret raised the rifle with trembling hands, pointing it at his chest. The weapon wavered, almost too heavy for her to hold steady. "Stay back," she managed, her voice barely above a whisper. The Apache leader's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. Not fear, certainly not of her or the rifle, but something else. Interest, perhaps. "You know how to use that?" he asked, taking one slow step forward. "I'll shoot," Margaret said, though even to her own ears it sounded unconvincing. Her finger found the trigger, but her whole body was shaking now. She had heard terrible stories about Apache raids, about what happened to white women captured by warriors. Terror warred with something else in her chest, something she couldn't quite name as she looked at this man who radiated such controlled power. "My name is Nachise," he said, pronouncing it carefully so she would understand. "I am the new chief of my people. We have been watching this ranch for 3 days." He took another step, moving with the fluid grace of a predator, yet there was no aggression in his approach. "I have seen the old man who owns you. I have seen how he treats you." Margaret's breath caught. They had been watching. They had seen Cornelius strike her 2 days ago when she had spoken out of turn, had seen her standing on the porch afterward with her hand pressed to her reddening cheek. Shame flooded through her, hot and bitter. "He is my husband," she said, though the word tasted like ashes in her mouth. "He is your jailer," Nachise corrected, now standing just 5 feet from the rifle's barrel. "Among my people, a man who treats a woman as property is not worthy to be called a man." The warriors at the door shifted, one of them speaking urgently in Apache. Nachise responded without looking away from Margaret, his tone sharp and final. Whatever he said silenced the objection. "Why are you here?" Margaret asked. "What do you want?" "We need cattle, medicine, supplies," Nachise said bluntly. "The American soldiers have driven us from our lands, killed our people, broken every treaty. We are hunted like animals. We take what we need to survive." His jaw tightened, a flash of pain crossing his features before his expression hardened again. "But I do not make war on women who are already prisoners." And something in his words, in the way he looked at her with those intense dark eyes, made Margaret's defenses crack. 3 years of isolation, of cruelty, of being treated as less than human by the man who claimed to own her, suddenly pressed down on her with crushing weight. Her arms began to lower, the rifle dipping as exhaustion swept through her. "I should fear you," she said softly, "but I find I'm too tired to fear anything anymore." Nachise studied her for a long moment, and something shifted in his expression, a softening that made him look younger, almost vulnerable. "Then we are alike," he said quietly. "I too am tired of fear, of running, of watching my people suffer. But I cannot stop. A chief does not have the luxury of surrender." The sound of distant horses carried through the open door, faint but growing louder. Cornelius was returning early. The warriors at the door spoke urgently, and Nachise's head turned sharply toward the sound. "Your husband comes," he said, his voice hardening. He looked back at Margaret, and in his eyes she saw a question, an offer she didn't fully understand, but felt in her bones. "What will you tell him?" Margaret's mind raced. She could tell Cornelius about the Apache, about their leader who spoke English and stood in their home. He would gather men, would hunt them, would kill them if he could. Or she could lie, could protect these strangers who had shown her more respect in 5 minutes than her husband had in 3 years. "Nothing," she whispered. "I'll tell him nothing." Nachise's eyes widened slightly, surprise flickering across his features. Then, slowly, he nodded. "You are braver than you know, Margaret Hayes." The sound of her name in his deep voice sent an unexpected shiver through her. "We will meet again. This I promise you." He turned and strode from the house, his warriors following. Within seconds, they had mounted and disappeared into the landscape like smoke on the wind, leaving no trace they had ever been there except the racing of Margaret's heart and the rifle still clutched in her trembling hands. When Cornelius rode up minutes later, he found her sitting in the rocking chair on the porch, the rifle across her lap, staring out at the empty desert. He dismounted heavily, his face already set in its customary scowl. "What are you doing out here with that?" he demanded, gesturing at the rifle. Margaret looked up at him, this old man who had bought her like livestock, and felt something new stirring in her chest. It was small and fragile, but it was there. The first spark of hope she'd felt in 3 years. "I thought I heard something," she said evenly. "Just being careful." Cornelius grunted and snatched the rifle from her hands. "Women and guns," he muttered. "Nothing but trouble together. Get inside and finish supper." As Margaret rose and walked past him into the house, she allowed herself one glance back at the desert horizon. Somewhere out there, Nachise rode with his warriors, carrying with him the secret she had chosen to keep, and somehow she knew with absolute certainty that he had spoken the truth. They would meet again. 3 weeks passed like a slow-burning fever. Margaret went through the motions of her daily life, cooking, cleaning, maintaining the illusion of dutiful wifehood. But something fundamental had shifted inside her. Every time she looked out at the desert, she remembered Nachise's words, the way he had seen her as a person rather than property. The memory of his presence, powerful and purposeful, haunted her waking hours and filled her dreams with images of freedom she had long ago stopped allowing herself to imagine. Cornelius noticed nothing. He never did. To him, Margaret was simply part of the ranch's inventory, like the furniture or the livestock, expected to function without requiring attention or consideration. He spent his days managing his cattle empire and his evenings drinking whiskey on the porch, occasionally barking orders at her or complaining about the Apache problem that had the whole territory on edge. "Damn savages are getting bolder," he grumbled one evening, his words slurred from drink. "Heard they hit the Morrison Ranch last week, took 30 head of cattle and all their horses. Didn't harm anyone, just took what they wanted and vanished. Got themselves a new chief, some young buck who thinks he's clever." He spat tobacco juice over the porch rail. "Army's offering a reward for information leading to their camp. $500 in gold." Margaret's hands stilled on the mending in her lap. $500 was a fortune, enough to buy a woman's passage back east, enough to start a new life far from this harsh land and the man who owned her. But even as the thought formed, she knew she would never betray Nachise's location, even if she knew it. Some debts ran deeper than money. The night was hot and still when Margaret woke to the sound of pebbles striking her bedroom window. She sat up quickly, her heart pounding, and moved to peer through the glass. The moon was nearly full, bathing the landscape in silver light, and there, standing in the shadows beside the house, was a tall figure she recognized instantly. Nachise raised his hand in a gesture that was both greeting and summons. Margaret's breath caught in her throat. Cornelius was asleep in his separate room down the hall, snoring heavily from his usual excess of whiskey. The house was silent except for the ticking of the grandfather clock in the parlor. She should ignore this. She should wake Cornelius, should sound the alarm. Instead, Margaret found herself pulling a shawl over her nightgown and slipping barefoot through the house like a ghost. She eased the back door open and stepped into the moonlit night. Nachise stood waiting, and up close she could see the lines of exhaustion etched into his handsome face. His clothing was dusty from hard riding, and there was a fresh bandage wrapped around his left forearm, dark with dried blood. But his eyes were as intense as she remembered, and when they settled on her, she felt that same electric recognition that had passed between them before. "You should not have come here," Margaret whispered urgently, glancing back at the house. "If Cornelius wakes, if he sees you, he'll kill you or die trying, and either way it will mean disaster." "I had to see you again," Nachise said simply. "I have thought of little else since we met. I have asked myself why a white woman would protect Apache warriors she had every reason to fear. I have wondered what kind of courage it takes to show mercy to those your people call enemies." Margaret wrapped her shawl tighter around herself, suddenly aware of how improper this was, standing in her nightclothes speaking with a man who was not her husband, and yet feeling safer than she had felt in years. "I didn't see enemies," she said softly. "I saw human beings. I saw someone who treated me with more respect in 5 minutes than my husband has shown me in 3 years." Nachise stepped closer, close enough that she could see the way the moonlight caught in his dark eyes. could smell the scent of sage and leather and smoke that clung to him. "Among my people," he said quietly, "when a woman is mistreated by her husband, she can leave him. She can return to her family or choose another path. A woman is not property to be owned. She is a person with her own will, her own strength." "That sounds like a dream," Margaret said, her voice breaking slightly. "In my world, I have no such freedom. My father sold me to pay his debts. The law says I belong to Cornelius until death parts us. There is no escape for women like me." "There is always escape," Nachise said fiercely. "You only need the courage to take it." He paused, studying her face with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Come with me now, tonight. I will take you far from here to places the white man's law cannot reach. You will be free." The offer hung in the air between them, impossible and tempting in equal measure. Margaret's mind filled with images of riding away into the night, of leaving behind this prison of a marriage, of finding a new life among people who valued freedom above all else. But reality crashed down like a cold wave. "They would hunt us," she said, tears stinging her eyes. "Cornelius would never let me go. He would gather every rancher and soldier in the territory. They would track us down, and when they found us, they would kill you, and everyone with you. And they would bring me back here to face punishment worse than anything I've endured yet." She shook her head, wiping at her eyes with trembling fingers. "I cannot be responsible for the deaths of your people, Nachise. I cannot be the reason you are captured or killed." Nachise's jaw tightened, frustration and something deeper, something like pain, flashing across his features. "So you will stay here? You will remain a prisoner because you fear what might happen if you choose freedom?" "I will stay because I must," Margaret said, her voice stronger now despite the tears streaming down her face. "Because some cages have locks we cannot break alone, no matter how much we wish otherwise." For a long moment, they stood in silence, the space between them filled with everything they could not say, everything they could not have. Then Nachise reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wished, and gently wiped a tear from her cheek with his thumb. The touch was so tender, so careful, that it broke something inside Margaret's chest. "Then I will find another way," he said firmly. "I did not become chief of my people by accepting defeat when the path forward is unclear. If you cannot come to me, then I will find a way to free you that does not endanger either of our peoples." "That's impossible," Margaret whispered, but even as she spoke, she felt hope flickering to life in her heart, dangerous and desperate. "I have done many impossible things," Nachise said with a slight smile that transformed his severe features into something breathtaking. "I will do one more." He stepped back, preparing to leave, but paused. 3 days from now at dawn, there will be a confrontation between my warriors and your husband. We will take his cattle, his horses. He will try to stop us. When this happens, I need you to trust me, Margaret. No matter what you see, no matter what happens, trust that I am working to free you." "I don't understand," Margaret said, fear creeping into her voice. "What are you planning?" "Something that will give you a choice," Nachise said. "Something that will show you that freedom is not a dream, but a possibility you can grasp with your own hands." His eyes held hers with burning intensity. 3 days. Be ready." Before Margaret could respond, before she could ask the 100 questions racing through her mind, Nachise melted back into the shadows. She heard the soft sound of a horse moving away, and then silence returned, leaving her standing alone in the moonlight, her heart pounding and her mind reeling with confusion and hope and terror, all tangled together. She returned to her room and lay awake until dawn, watching the sky lighten through her window, wondering what Nachise was planning and whether she had the courage to face whatever choice he intended to give her. 3 days. 3 days until everything changed. The next morning, Cornelius was in a foul mood, ranting about reports of Apache movements in the area. "They're planning something," he snarled over breakfast, slamming his fist on the table hard enough to make the dishes jump. "I can feel it. Every rancher within 50 miles is on alert. If those savages show their faces on my land, I'll put bullets in every last one of them." Margaret kept her eyes on her plate, her hands steady as she cut her food, giving no sign of the storm raging inside her. "Perhaps you should send for help from town," she suggested carefully. "If you truly believe an attack is coming." "I don't need help defending what's mine," Cornelius snapped. "I've got 6 ranch hands, all good with rifles. We can handle a pack of Apache raiders." He leaned back in his chair, his cold eyes settling on Margaret with calculation. "Besides, the army's stretched thin. They're too busy chasing that new chief, Nachisi, the one stirring up all this trouble. Put a price on his head, they have. $1,000 for him, dead or alive." Margaret's blood turned to ice, but she forced herself to remain calm, to show nothing. "That's quite a sum," she said neutrally. "It is," Cornelius agreed, watching her too closely. "Makes a man think. You see any strange Apache around here, you tell me immediately. Understand?" "Of course," Margaret said, meeting his gaze without flinching. "I would tell you if I saw anything unusual." The lie came easily, and Margaret realized with a start that she had changed over these past weeks. The frightened girl who had stood at the window 3 weeks ago, too paralyzed to even bar her door, was gone. In her place was someone harder, someone who had learned that survival sometimes required deception, and that loyalty to one's jailer was not a virtue, but a form of suicide. The 3 days crawled by with agonizing slowness. Margaret prepared, though she wasn't entirely sure what she was preparing for. She packed a small bag with her few personal belongings and hid it under her bed. She studied the ranch's layout with new eyes, noting where the horses were kept, which routes led away from the property most quickly, where Cornelius kept his weapons and ammunition. On the 3rd morning, she woke before dawn and dressed carefully in her most practical clothing, sturdy boots and a split riding skirt she had sewn in secret months ago, dreaming of impossible escapes. When she came downstairs, Cornelius was already awake, along with his 6 ranch hands, all of them armed and tense. "Get back upstairs," Cornelius ordered when he saw her. "There's going to be trouble today. I can smell it." "I want to help," Margaret said, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. "I can load rifles, carry ammunition. I can be useful." Cornelius studied her suspiciously. "Since when do you want to be useful in a fight?" "Since I realized that this is my home too," Margaret lied smoothly. "If Apache raiders come, they won't discriminate. I should know how to defend myself." Something like approval flickered in Cornelius's eyes, the first time he had looked at her with anything other than contempt or indifference in months. "All right then," he said grudgingly. "You stay in the house and keep watch from the windows. You see anything, you holler. And keep that rifle I gave you nearby, though I doubt you'd have the nerve to actually fire it if it came down to it." Margaret said nothing, just nodded, and took her position at the front window as the sky began to lighten from black to deep blue. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she watched the desert come alive with the rising sun. And then, as the first rays of light broke over the horizon, they came. The Apache warriors appeared like specters emerging from the dawn mist, their horses moving in perfect synchronization across the desert floor. Margaret counted at least 30 riders, more than Nachisi had brought to the house that first time, and they rode with the confidence of men who knew exactly what they were doing. At their center, unmistakable even at a distance, rode Nachisi himself, tall and commanding, his presence radiating authority and purpose. "They're here," one of the ranch hands shouted from the bunkhouse, and immediately the air filled with the metallic sounds of rifles being cocked and men taking defensive positions. Cornelius rushed to the window where Margaret stood, shoving her aside roughly as he raised his rifle. "Get down, you stupid woman," he snarled, "unless you want your head blown off when the shooting starts." But Margaret didn't move. She stood frozen at the window, watching as the Apache riders formed a wide arc in front of the ranch house, just out of easy rifle range. They made no aggressive moves, simply sat their horses and waited, the rising sun painting them in shades of gold and crimson. Nachisi rode forward alone, stopping his horse perhaps 50 yards from the house. His voice carried clearly in the still morning air as he called out in English, speaking loud enough for everyone to hear. "Cornelius Hayes, I am Nachisi, chief of the Chiricahua Apache. I have come to speak with you about the cattle you graze on land that belongs to my people. Send out someone to negotiate, or we will take what we need by force." "Like hell!" Cornelius roared back, leaning out the window with his rifle aimed at Nachisi's chest. "You're on my land, you savage bastard. These are my cattle bought and paid for legal. You got no claim here. The land belonged to my ancestors for 1,000 years before your people arrived with your papers and your lies. Nachise responded, his voice calm but carrying an edge of steel. We do not recognize your ownership of what was stolen from us, but I am willing to negotiate rather than spill blood this day. Send someone to speak or face the consequences. Cornelius's face turned purple with rage. The only thing I'm sending you is bullets. He squeezed the trigger, and the rifle crack split the morning air. The shot went wide, kicking up dust several feet to Nachise's left. The Apache chief didn't flinch, didn't move, simply sat his horse with absolute calm, as if he had known exactly where the bullet would land. You have made your choice, Nachise said, and there was something like sadness in his voice. He raised his hand, and immediately his warriors began to move, not toward the house but toward the corrals where Cornelius's horses and cattle were kept. Stop them! Cornelius screamed at his men. Don't let them take my stock. The ranch hands opened fire, and the Apache warriors returned it with devastating accuracy. But Margaret realized with growing comprehension that neither side was actually trying to hit the other. The Apache bullets thudded into fence posts and walls, staying well clear of where the ranch hands had taken cover. The return fire from Cornelius's men was less precise, more panicked, but the Apache moved with such fluid grace that they seemed to dance between the bullets, herding the cattle and horses away from the ranch with practiced efficiency. It was a performance, Margaret realized with sudden clarity. This entire confrontation was staged, choreographed for a specific purpose. But what purpose? What was Nachise trying to achieve? Cornelius was beside himself with fury, firing shot after shot toward the Apache warriors, each one missing by yards. Cowards! He screamed. Stand and fight like men! And then everything changed in an instant. Nachise wheeled his horse and rode directly toward the house, moving with reckless speed that should have made him an easy target. Cornelius tracked him with the rifle, his hands shaking with rage, squeezing off shot after shot. One bullet came so close that it tore through the sleeve of Nachise's vest, but still he came on, fearless and determined. He pulled his horse to a sliding stop directly in front of the porch, close enough that Margaret could see the fierce determination in his dark eyes. For a heartbeat, their gazes locked through the window, and she saw the question there, the invitation, the challenge. Margaret Hayes, Nachise called out, his voice cutting through the chaos of gunfire and shouting men. You have lived as a prisoner long enough. I offer you freedom. Come with me now, and no one will stop you. This is your choice to make. The words hung in the air like a thunderclap. Every gun fell silent. Every man froze. Cornelius turned to stare at Margaret with an expression of such rage and disbelief that for a moment he seemed incapable of speech. What? The word came out as barely more than a whisper. Then, louder, his face contorting with fury. What did that savage just say to you? Margaret's heart was hammering so hard she thought it might burst from her chest. This was the moment. This was the choice Nachise had promised her. Freedom or captivity, fear or courage, death of the spirit or birth of something new. He offered me freedom, Margaret said, her voice steady and clear, surprised by her own calm. Something you have never given me in 3 years of marriage. Cornelius's hand shot out and grabbed her arm with brutal force, his fingers digging in hard enough to leave bruises. You're not going anywhere, he hissed, spittle flying from his lips. You're my wife, my property. I bought and paid for you, and you'll stay right here until you die or I tire of you, whichever comes first. The words, spoken with such casual cruelty, crystallized something inside Margaret. All the years of submission, of swallowing her anger and her pain, of making herself small and silent and invisible, suddenly seemed not just unbearable, but actively offensive to her very existence. She looked at this old man who had never seen her as human, who had treated her with less care than he showed his horses, and something inside her simply refused to tolerate it any longer. Let go of me, she said quietly. I'll do no such thing, Cornelius snarled. You'll get upstairs right now and lock yourself in your room, and when this is over, you and I are going to have a very serious conversation about obedience and consequences. Margaret's eyes moved to the rifle Cornelius had set down on the windowsill when he'd grabbed her. Before she could think, before fear could stop her, she snatched it up with her free hand and yanked herself from his grasp, stumbling backward and raising the weapon. Cornelius froze, his eyes widening with shock. Then his face twisted into an ugly sneer. "You ain't got the nerve to fire that woman," he said with absolute certainty. "You've never had the spine to stand up for yourself. You're weak, just like your father was weak. Put that down before you hurt yourself." Margaret's hands were shaking, but she kept the rifle pointed at his chest. Through the window, she could see Nachise still sitting his horse, watching, waiting. His warriors had stopped herding the cattle and were positioned in a defensive line, ready to intervene but holding back, giving her space to make this choice herself. And there, barely visible, Nachise gave her the smallest nod, a gesture of encouragement and support that said more clearly than words, "You are strong enough. You can do this." "I am not weak," Margaret said, her voice growing stronger with each word. "I have survived 3 years of your cruelty. I have endured your contempt and your control. I have lived in a cage of your making, and remained myself despite everything you did to break me. That is not weakness, Cornelius. That is strength you could never understand. Big words from a woman holding a gun she doesn't know how to use." Cornelius sneered, taking a step toward her. "You pull that trigger, you'll hang for murder. They don't take kindly to wives killing their husbands, even out here in the territories." "Then it's fortunate," Margaret said, surprised by the cold calm that had settled over her, "that I have no intention of killing you." She shifted her aim downward and squeezed the trigger. The rifle kicked against her shoulder with brutal force, nearly knocking her backward, and the explosion seemed impossibly loud in the confined space of the room. The bullet struck the floor 6 inches in front of Cornelius's boots, sending splinters of wood flying and leaving a dark hole in the floorboards. Cornelius jumped back with a startled curse, all his certainty evaporating in an instant. Margaret saw fear flash across his face, genuine fear. Perhaps the first time in his life he had been afraid of someone weaker than himself. She lowered the rifle but didn't set it down, keeping it ready at her side. "I could have killed you just now," she said quietly, "but I choose not to because I am not like you. I do not need to destroy others to prove my worth." She moved toward the door, keeping her eyes on Cornelius, who stood frozen in shock. "I am leaving now. I am choosing freedom. You will not follow me. You will not send men after me. Because if you do, I promise you that next time I will not miss, and you will discover that I have far more nerve than you ever gave me credit for." She reached the door and pulled it open. The morning air rushed in, carrying the scent of sage and dust and possibility. Nachise had dismounted and stood at the bottom of the porch steps, his hand extended toward her, his eyes burning with pride and something deeper, something that made her heart race for entirely different reasons than fear. "Margaret, you walk out that door and you're making yourself an outlaw," Cornelius said, his voice shaking with impotent rage. "The law will hunt you. The army will hunt you. You'll be branded a traitor to your own people, a squaw lover worse than the savages themselves." Margaret paused at the threshold and looked back at him one final time. "My people," she said softly, "are those who treat me as human, those who see my worth, those who offer me choice rather than chains. And if that makes me a traitor to your world, then I embrace that title gladly." She stepped out onto the porch and walked down the steps, the rifle still in her hands, her head held high. Each step felt like shedding a layer of prison walls, like breathing air for the first time after years underwater. Nachise met her at the bottom, his eyes searching her face with an intensity that stole her breath. "Are you certain?" he asked quietly, speaking only for her to hear. "Once you ride away with us, there is no going back. You will be hunted. Your life will be hard. You will face dangers you cannot yet imagine." "I am certain," Margaret said, and she had never been more certain of anything in her life. "I would rather face danger as a free woman than safety as a slave." Something fierce and bright blazed in Nachise's eyes, and a smile transformed his face into something radiant. Without another word, he led her to his horse and helped her mount, then swung up behind her, his arms coming around her to take the reins. The warmth of his body against her back, solid and protective, felt like coming home. Nachise raised his hand high, and with a series of sharp calls in Apache, his warriors began to move. They formed a protective circle around Margaret and their chief, and then as one unified force they turned and rode hard toward the distant mountains, the stolen cattle and horses streaming ahead of them in a cloud of dust that rose like smoke against the brightening sky. Margaret clung to the saddle horn as the horse thundered across the desert floor, the wind whipping her hair loose from its pins and streaming it behind her like a golden banner. Behind them, she could hear Cornelius's enraged screaming, could hear the sporadic crack of rifle fire. But the distance was growing rapidly, and within minutes the ranch had disappeared behind a rise in the land, swallowed by the vast emptiness of the Arizona territory. They rode for hours, pushing the horses hard, changing direction multiple times to confuse any potential pursuit. The Apache warriors moved with practiced efficiency, communicating through hand signals and brief calls, working together like a single organism. Margaret had never seen anything like it. This perfect coordination born of years of fighting for survival in a hostile land. As the sun climbed higher and the heat became oppressive, Nachise finally signaled a halt in a narrow canyon, where a spring bubbled up from between red rocks, creating a small oasis of green in the parched landscape. The warriors immediately set about watering the horses and posting sentries at both ends of the canyon, their movements quick and purposeful. Nachise dismounted and lifted Margaret down with gentle hands, steadying her when her legs nearly buckled after the long ride. She had never ridden so far or so fast in her life, and every muscle in her body was screaming in protest. But beneath the physical discomfort was an exhilaration unlike anything she had ever known, a wild joy that made her want to laugh and cry at the same time. "We will rest here for an hour," Nachise said, leading her to a shaded spot beneath an overhanging rock. "Then we must ride again. Your husband will send men after us, and we must reach our camp in the mountains before they can organize a proper pursuit." Margaret sank down onto a flat rock, gratefully accepting the water skin one of the warriors handed her. She drank deeply, the cool water the most delicious thing she had ever tasted, then looked up at Nachise, who stood watching her with an expression that was part concern, part admiration, and part something else she was afraid to name. "I cannot believe I actually did that," she said, shaking her head in wonder. "I pointed a gun at my husband and walked away. Just walked away from everything I've known for 3 years. "You did more than walk away," Nachise said, crouching down so they were at eye level. "You claimed your freedom. You showed courage that many warriors twice your size would struggle to find. You should be proud of what you did today, Margaret." The sound of her name in his deep voice still sent shivers through her. "I'm terrified," she admitted. "Not of what I've done, but of what comes next. I don't know how to survive in this world. I don't speak Apache. I don't know your customs or your ways. I'll be a burden to your people, someone they'll have to protect and care for when they're already struggling to survive." Nachise's hand came up to cup her cheek with surprising gentleness, his calloused fingers warm against her skin. "You will learn," he said firmly. "You have already shown you have the strength to adapt, to overcome, and you will not be a burden. My people value courage above all else, and you have shown more courage this morning than many show in a lifetime." One of the older warriors approached and spoke rapidly in Apache, gesturing back the way they had come. Nachise's expression hardened, and he responded in the same language, his tone sharp and decisive. The warrior nodded and moved away to relay orders to the others. "What is it?" Margaret asked, fear creeping into her voice. "Are they coming?" "Riders approaching from the east," Nachise said, rising to his feet and offering her his hand. 6 men, moving fast. Your husband is not wasting time." His jaw tightened with determination. "We need to move now. Can you ride further?" Margaret took his hand and stood, ignoring the protests of her aching muscles. "I can do whatever I must to stay free," she said firmly. Pride flashed in Nachise's eyes, and for a moment, she thought he might say something more, but instead, he simply nodded and led her back to his horse. Within minutes, the Apache had mounted up, and they were riding again, pushing deeper into the wilderness toward the distant purple mountains that promised sanctuary. The pursuit was relentless. Throughout the afternoon and into the evening, Margaret could occasionally catch glimpses of the riders behind them, persistent shadows that refused to give up the chase. Cornelius had clearly offered them significant incentive to bring her back, probably a substantial reward, and they were determined to earn it. As the sun began to set, painting the desert in shades of orange and crimson, they finally reached the foothills of the mountains. The terrain became rougher, forcing them to slow their pace, picking their way carefully along narrow trails that wound between towering rock formations. The Apache knew these paths intimately, but the pursuers would have to proceed with caution, buying precious time. Darkness fell, and Nachise made the decision to continue riding by moonlight rather than stop. "We are close to our camp now," he told Margaret quietly, his arms secure around her as the horse navigated the treacherous path. "Just a few more hours. Can you hold on?" "Yes," Margaret said, though exhaustion was dragging at her like weights tied to her limbs. She leaned back against Nachise's chest, drawing strength from his steady presence, from the rhythm of his heartbeat against her back. As they rode through the darkness, he began to speak, his voice low and meant only for her. "I must tell you something, Margaret Hayes. Something I should have said before you made your choice to come with us, but I was afraid it would influence your decision, and I needed you to choose freedom for yourself, not for any other reason." "What is it?" Margaret asked, her heart beginning to race. "From the moment I saw you standing in that window, pointing a rifle at me with shaking hands but refusing to back down, I knew you were extraordinary," Nachise said, and she could hear the emotion in his voice, carefully controlled but unmistakably present. "I told myself I was watching the ranch to plan our raid, to assess the defenses, to count the men and weapons. But the truth is, I kept returning to watch you, to see the woman who lived as a prisoner, but had not been broken by captivity." Margaret's breath caught in her throat. She turned her head slightly, trying to see his face in the moonlight. "I have led my people through terrible times," Nachise continued. "I have made hard choices, sacrificed much, lived with constant danger and uncertainty. I believe there was no room in such a life for softer feelings, for the kind of connection that makes a man vulnerable. But then I met you, and I understood that strength is not the absence of feeling, but the courage to feel deeply despite the risks." "Nachise," Margaret whispered, his name feeling sacred on her lips. "I am telling you this now because you deserve honesty," he said. "You have given up everything to claim your freedom. I will help you build a new life, will protect you and teach you our ways, and I will ask nothing in return except the privilege of knowing you are safe and free. But you should know that my heart is not neutral in this matter. It has not been neutral since the beginning." Margaret's eyes filled with tears, but they were not tears of sadness. For the first time in so long, they were tears of something like joy, of possibility, of a future that held more than just survival. "My heart is not neutral either," she said softly. "I think it knew from that first moment, when you looked at me and saw a person rather than property. I think it has been yours since then, though I was too afraid to acknowledge it." Nachise's arms tightened around her, and she felt him press his face briefly against her hair, a gesture of such tender emotion that it made her heart ache. "Then when we reach safety," he said quietly, "when the immediate danger has passed and you have had time to truly understand what life among my people means, I would ask your permission to court you properly, in the Apache way, to give you time to know me not just as the man who helped you escape, but as the man who wishes to walk beside you through whatever comes." "I would like that very much," Margaret said, and meant it with every fiber of her being. They rode on through the night, and finally, as the moon reached its zenith, they crested a ridge and looked down into a hidden valley. There, sheltered among ancient pine trees and protected by steep canyon walls, was the Apache camp. Dozens of wickiups, traditional dome-shaped dwellings, clustered around several fires. People moved among them, and as Nachise signaled their approach, figures began to emerge to welcome their chief's return. The warriors guided the stolen cattle and horses into a makeshift corral, while Nachise dismounted and helped Margaret down. She stood on shaking legs, looking around at the camp with wide eyes, suddenly acutely aware that she was the only white person among dozens of Apache, that she was entering a world completely foreign to everything she had known. An elderly woman approached, her face weathered but kind, her dark eyes assessing Margaret with sharp intelligence. She spoke to Nachise in Apache, her tone questioning, and he responded at length, gesturing to Margaret with obvious respect. The woman's expression softened, and she nodded slowly, then spoke again, this time with what sounded like approval. "This is Dansda, my grandmother," Nachisi explained to Margaret. "She is the eldest of our band, very respected. I have told her what you did today, how you chose freedom over safety. She says you are welcome here, that any woman brave enough to fire a gun at her oppressor and walk away deserves a place among our people." The old woman stepped forward and placed her hand on Margaret's shoulder, speaking in Apache. Nachisi translated, "She says you look exhausted and hungry. She will take you to her wickiup, give you food and a place to rest. Tomorrow, when you have recovered your strength, we will begin teaching you our ways." Margaret felt tears threaten again at this unexpected kindness from strangers who had every reason to distrust anyone from the world that hunted them. "Thank you," she said to the old woman, then looked at Nachise. "Thank you for everything, for seeing me when I was invisible, for offering me a choice when I thought I had none, for being the kind of man who values freedom enough to risk everything for it." Nachise took her hand, his thumb brushing across her knuckles in a gentle caress. "Rest now," he said softly. "You are safe here. No one will take you back to that prison. I promise you this on my life and my honor as chief." As Dansda led Margaret toward her dwelling, Margaret looked back once and saw Nachise standing in the firelight, watching her with an expression that held both fierce protectiveness and tender hope. In that moment, she knew with absolute certainty that whatever challenges lay ahead, whatever hardships she would face adapting to this new life, she had made the right choice. She had chosen freedom. And in choosing freedom, she had found something she never expected, the possibility of love, with a man who saw her as an equal, who valued her courage, who would stand beside her rather than over her. The days that followed were filled with learning and adaptation. Margaret threw herself into understanding Apache ways with the same determination that had carried her through 3 years of survival under Cornelius's cruelty. Dansda became her teacher and protector, patiently showing her how to prepare food, how to maintain a wickiup, how to dress in the practical clothing of Apache women. Other women in the camp, initially wary, gradually warmed to her as they saw her willingness to work hard and learn their customs without expecting special treatment. Nachise was often away during those first weeks, leading warriors on raids for supplies, negotiating with other Apache bands, staying ahead of the army patrols that constantly searched for them. But when he was in camp, he sought Margaret out, walking with her in the evenings, teaching her Apache words and phrases, sharing stories of his people's history and culture. Their connection deepened with each conversation, built on mutual respect and understanding, on recognition of shared strength and complementary spirits. 2 months after her escape, word reached the camp that Cornelius Hayes had given up the search. Humiliated by his wife's defection and the loss of significant livestock, he had sold his ranch and returned east, unable to face the mockery and questions from other ranchers. The news came from a Mexican trader who sometimes brought supplies to the Apache, a man who knew how to keep secrets and valued the gold Nachise paid him. That evening, Nachise found Margaret sitting on a rock overlooking the valley, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant colors. He sat beside her in companionable silence for a long moment before speaking. "You are truly free now," he said quietly. "The man who claimed to own you is gone. He cannot hurt you anymore." "I was free the moment I walked down those porch steps," Margaret said, looking at him with clear eyes. "Everything since has simply been learning to live in that freedom." She paused, then added softly, "And learning what it means to share that freedom with someone who values it as much as I do." Nachise turned to face her fully, his dark eyes intense in the fading light. "I told you once that I would court you properly in the Apache way, when you had time to understand what life among my people truly means. You have lived with us now for 2 moons. You have learned our language, shared our struggles, proven yourself time and again. So I ask you now, Margaret Hayes, will you allow me to court you? Will you consider becoming not just a member of our band, but my partner, my equal, the woman who stands beside me as we face whatever comes?" Margaret's heart swelled with an emotion so powerful it took her breath away. This man, this brave, honorable, complicated man who led his people with wisdom and strength, who had risked everything to give her a choice, who looked at her like she was precious beyond measure, was asking permission to love her openly. Yes, she said simply. Yes to all of it. Nachise smiled, that transformative smile that made him look younger and lighter, and reached for her hand. Then I will speak to Dansda and the elders tomorrow. We will do this properly, with all the traditions and ceremonies. I want everyone to know that I choose you freely, and that you choose me the same way, with no coercion, no ownership, only mutual respect and affection. Love, Margaret corrected gently. Not just affection. Love. Love, Nachise agreed, the word sounding both foreign and perfect in his accented English. He raised her hand to his lips and kissed it with reverent tenderness. I love you, Margaret Hayes. Your courage, your strength, your refusal to be broken by cruelty. I love the woman who pointed a rifle at her oppressor and chose freedom over safety. I love the woman who has learned our ways without losing herself. I love you. I love you too, Margaret said, tears streaming down her face, happy tears that tasted like freedom and hope. I love the man who saw me when I was invisible, who offered me choice when I thought I had none, who values freedom enough to risk everything for it, not just for himself, but for others. I love you, Nachise. They sat together as the sun disappeared below the horizon, and the first stars emerged in the darkening sky, holding hands and planning a future neither of them had imagined was possible. In a world that tried to divide them, that saw them as enemies, they had found in each other something transcendent, partnership built on mutual respect, love born from recognized courage, freedom shared and celebrated. 3 months later, they were married in a traditional Apache ceremony, with Dansda presiding and the entire camp celebrating. Margaret wore a beautiful buckskin dress decorated with intricate beadwork that the women of the camp had made for her, a gift that represented her full acceptance into their community. Nachise stood tall and proud, his hand clasped in hers, his voice strong as he made his vows in both Apache and English, so that everyone, including his new wife, would understand the promises he was making. Life was not easy. The Apache continued to face persecution and hardship, continued to fight for their right to exist freely in the land of their ancestors. There were battles and losses, close calls with army patrols, harsh winters and scarce resources. But through it all, Margaret and Nachise stood together, partners in every sense of the word, drawing strength from each other and from the community they had built. Margaret learned to be a warrior in her own right, not with weapons but with wisdom, serving as a bridge between worlds, helping negotiate with traitors and occasionally with sympathetic soldiers who could be reasoned with. Her unique position as a white woman who had chosen Apache life gave her insights and opportunities that helped her new people survive. Years passed, and their love deepened, matured, became the bedrock upon which they built not just a marriage but a life of purpose and meaning. They had children, raised them to be strong and free, taught them to value courage and choice above all else. And sometimes, on quiet evenings when they sat together watching the sunset, Margaret would remember that hot July morning when a young Apache chief had ridden up to a ranch house and offered a frightened woman a choice. She would remember the feeling of pointing a rifle at her oppressor, of walking down those porch steps toward an uncertain future, of choosing freedom despite the fear. No regrets? Nachise would sometimes ask, though by now he knew the answer. Not a single one, Margaret would always reply, taking his hand and holding it tight. You gave me freedom, and I gave you my heart. That seems like a fair trade to me. And Nachise would smile, that transformative smile she had fallen in love with, and pull her close, and together they would watch the day fade into night, free and loved and home at last.